All right, so let's jump right into it. This deep dive, all about the disappearance of Sudiksha Konanki.
Yeah.
It's a case that has a lot of people talking, and it's understandable why a 20-year-old University of Pittsburgh student vanishes during spring break.
Right.
In Punta Cana, it's like every parent's worst nightmare.
Absolutely.
March 6th, 2025.
Wow.
That's the last anyone saw of her, and we've got news articles, investigative reports, official statements, even social media posts.
Oh, wow.
All trying to figure out what happened, but there are just so many questions that are unanswered.
And that's what makes this case so interesting, right? We're not talking about some cold case. This is an active investigation, and we're basically watching it unfold in real time.
Exactly. So Sudiksha was in Punta Cana with 5 friends staying at the RIU Republica Resort.
Okay.
Spring break, picture-perfect beaches, the scene. But here's something that makes this even more interesting. At the time, the Dominican Republic was under a Level 2 travel advisory from the U.S. State Department.
Mm-hmm.
They were urging travelers to be really careful because of crime.
And that advisory is even more important when you think about some of the things guests at the RIU Republica were saying. There was a huge power outage at the resort. It lasted a full 25 hours.
What?
And it ended just a few hours before Sudiksha vanished.
Wait, a 25-hour power outage? That's not just like a little inconvenience. That's a big deal.
Yeah.
Do we know what caused it?
Well, the details about what caused it haven't been made public, but guests have said it was chaotic during that outage.
Oh, wow.
No AC, sweltering rooms, people going to the beach to try and escape the heat. Now imagine that a beach in the Dominican Republic in the dark with a power outage and a travel advisory saying, be careful because of crime.
Yeah, suddenly those idyllic spring break vibes are totally gone.
And there's another thing that's a little unsettling, reports of red flags on the beach, warning about strong currents and big waves.
We've got this backdrop of potential safety concerns, and then on March 6th, Sudiksha and her friends go to a nightclub and then head to the beach around 4 a.m. with 2 men they met earlier.
Okay.
And there's actually surveillance footage showing them going there.
Yes, and that footage shows the friends going back to their rooms at around 5:55 a.m. without Sudiksha.
But she wasn't alone on the beach, right?
Right. There was a man with her. According to him, they went swimming, got hit by a big wave, and he got sick and passed out. He says he woke up disoriented and went back to the hotel before 10 a.m. and didn't know where Sudiksha was.
That's a pretty scary story. I mean, getting hit by a wave in the dark, maybe being disoriented, makes you wonder how much he actually remembers.
That's a really important point. Eyewitness testimony, especially in stressful or scary situations, can be really unreliable. The human brain, when it's under pressure, can fill in gaps, change timelines, even create fake memories.
So the Dominican authorities know about this man's story, right? Do they think he's a suspect?
They've said publicly that they don't think he's a suspect right now. But, and here's where things get even more complicated. The Loudoun County Sheriff's Office, back in Sudiksha's hometown in Virginia, said a man named Joshua Ribe is a person of interest in the case. Ribe was also on vacation in Punta Cana at the same time, but wasn't part of Sudiksha's group.
Well, and so we have U.S. law enforcement naming a person of interest, but Dominican authorities saying he's not a suspect. What's happening there?
It's like a jurisdictional puzzle, and it shows how hard it is to investigate something that involves multiple countries. The Loudoun County Sheriff's Office probably has their reasons for calling Ribe a person of interest, but the Dominican authorities who are leading the investigation there don't have to do the same thing.
So what does person of interest even mean here? Is it different from being a suspect?
It's a small but important difference. A person of interest is someone investigators think might have info about the case. They might have been nearby, they might have known the missing person, but they're not necessarily a suspect.
Okay, so in a way it's like casting a wider net, getting info from anyone who might have even a tiny piece of the puzzle.
Exactly. And that's what investigators are doing right now, casting a wide net, trying to piece together a timeline that's really fragmented.
So they're gathering information.
Mm-hmm.
But what about actually finding Sudiksha? What's being done about that?
The search has been really big. Over 300 people have been involved searching on land, and in the water they're using drones, helicopters, and maritime rescue teams. It's a huge effort, but the Dominican Republic National Police seem like they're really trying hard to find her.
And they're not the only ones, right? I remember reading that other agencies are involved too.
You're right. The Loudoun County Sheriff's Office is involved, of course, since Sudiksha is from Virginia. But there's also the U.S. Attorney General's Office, the FBI, the U.S. Embassy, even the University of Pittsburgh police are all helping out in some way. It's a big international effort.
It really shows how complicated these cases can be, especially when they cross borders. You've got different legal systems, different ways of investigating language barriers. It's a lot to deal with.
Absolutely. And it can cause confusion, like we saw with the different statements about Joshua Uribe. But in the end, all these agencies are working towards the same thing, finding Sudiksha and bringing her home.
So let's go back to what happened. You mentioned before that guests at the RIU Republica said things were chaotic during the power outage. Are there any specific stories that stand out to you?
There are a few that I thought were really interesting. One guest, Delaney Sweeney, said the night Sudiksha disappeared was chaotic, specifically because of the power outage. She said people were hanging out by the pools and on the beach because it was too hot in their rooms without AC.
That makes sense.
Yeah.
I can't imagine being stuck in a hotel room in the Dominican Republic without AC. You'd want to find somewhere cooler.
Exactly. And she specifically mentioned the beach was pitch black with no lights, which is what we'd expect with the power being out. That detail is really important because it tells us about how much people could see or couldn't see on the beach that night.
It sounds kind of scary. You've
Yeah.
got people on the beach in the dark, maybe confused, and then Sudiksha vanishes.
Another guest, Nick Muska, was frustrated with the situation. He said, "The water doesn't work. There was no power yesterday. This is terrible." It gives you an idea of what it was like at the resort at that time.
So we have these stories from guests saying things were tough. But what about the resort itself? What are they saying about all this?
The RIU Republica has kept saying that the power outage and Sudiksha's disappearance are completely unrelated. They say security cameras were working and that they're cooperating with the investigation.
But if the beach was pitch black, like the guest said, wouldn't that affect the security cameras? Even if they were working, how much could they actually see in the dark?
That's a good question, and it's one that investigators are probably looking into. The quality of the footage, the angles of the cameras, the lighting, all these things will determine how much useful information they can get from the videos.
And it's not just about the cameras, right? If the power outage caused chaos, like the guest said, wouldn't that have affected security at the resort overall?
That's a possibility they can't ignore. If staff were busy dealing with the power outage, if guests were spread out more than usual because of the lack of AC, it makes sense that security might not have been as strong. It doesn't mean the resort is directly responsible for Sudiksha's disappearance, but it does make you wonder if the power outage made things more vulnerable.
So we have this thing with the power outage and the possible security issues. Then we have the different stories about what happened on the beach. And then there's Joshua Uribe, the person of interest named by the Loudoun County Sheriff's Office. It's a lot to think about.
It is. And as we try to put all this together, we have to think about not just what happened, but why. Why did the Sheriff's Office name Uribe a person of interest if the Dominican authorities haven't? What do they know that we don't? And maybe even more importantly, why hasn't Uribe said anything publicly about his connection to the case?
Those are great questions. And honestly, they're the kind that make me think a lot when I'm following these cases. It's like we're seeing parts of the puzzle, but we're missing so many pieces.
And to add to that, the Dominican authorities are being very quiet about the details of their investigation. They've said they're looking at surveillance footage, phone records, and talking to people who are near Sudiksha again, but they're not sharing much with the public.
I get why they want to protect the investigation, but it's frustrating, isn't it? We're left guessing, trying to connect the dots with the little information we have.
And that's where the danger is in jumping to conclusions and filling in the gaps with our own ideas. It's really important to remember this is an active investigation and we don't have all the information. What might seem like a really important clue today could be nothing tomorrow.
So what can we do?
Yeah.
We can't just sit here and wait for the Dominican authorities to tell us more, can we?
We can do what good investigators do.
Yeah.
We can look at the information we do have, we can look for patterns, and we can ask ourselves the hard questions. Did something happen on that beach that night that no one is talking about? Is there a piece of evidence we haven't seen that changes everything?
It's like a real mystery happening right in front of us, but with real consequences. We're not talking about fictional characters here. We're talking about a young woman whose life is on the line.
Exactly. And as we look deeper into this case, it's important to remember the human side of it. Sudiksha Konanki isn't just a name in the news. She's a real person with a story, and that story is still being written.
And hopefully that story has a happy ending.
We can only hope. But for now, we have to be patient. We have to be careful about how we judge the information, and we have to remember that every part of this puzzle, every detail, every story represents a real person and what they went through.
Yeah, it's easy to get lost in all the details of an investigation like this. But you're right, we can't forget about the real people involved. The young woman is missing, and her family and friends are going through something terrible.
And it's not just about Sudiksha and the people who care about her. This case also makes us think about safety and responsibility, especially when we travel to other countries. We talked about the level 2 travel advisory for the Dominican Republic, but how many people actually pay attention to this?
Honestly, I've ignored them in the past thinking, oh, that'll never happen to me. But this case is a reminder that those advisories are there for a reason.
They're based on real things that have happened. And while you can't avoid all risks when you travel, knowing about possible dangers can help you make better decisions.
So we've talked about the power outage, the different stories, the person of interest, and how hard it is to investigate something that involves multiple countries. What do you think is the weirdest part of all this?
For me, it's how the resort has reacted. They're so sure that the power outage has nothing to do with Sudiksha's disappearance. They keep talking about the security footage and how she was seen leaving a bar with a group, but
You're not so sure. What makes you question their explanation?
it's the timing that gets me. The power comes back on just a few hours before she disappears. Guests are saying it was chaotic. People were going to the beach because there was no AC. Doesn't it seem possible that the outage, even if it didn't directly cause her disappearance, could have made the environment less safe?
I see what you mean. It's not about blaming anyone, but about recognizing that the outage might have created conditions that made something like this more likely to happen.
Exactly. Maybe if the power had been on security, would have been better. The beach wouldn't have been so dark and someone might have noticed something wasn't right.
So if we think about the possibility that the power outage played a part, even if it was indirect, what does that mean for the investigation? Does it change things?
It definitely makes things more complicated. Investigators now have to think about not only what happened on the beach that night, but also how the power outage might have affected security at the resort. It might make them look into the resort's safety rules, what they do during outages, things like that.
We've learned a lot, and it's clear that this case is far from solved. What would you say is the most important thing for our listeners to take away from this?
I think the most important thing is to think critically. Don't just believe everything you hear. Question the sources. Think about the biases. Look for things that don't add up. We've heard different stories from witnesses, different statements from law enforcement, and a resort that seems to be downplaying how big of a deal the outage was. It's up to each of us to look at the information carefully and come to our own conclusions.
You're right. We can't just rely on what we're being told. We have to use our own judgment and decide what we think for ourselves.
And remember, this isn't just a mystery to solve. It's about a young woman's life and the lives of her loved ones that have been changed forever. Let's hope the truth comes out soon and that Sudiksha's family can finally get the answers they deserve.
Well said. And for our listeners, if this deep dive has made you think about travel safety, international investigations, or even just the real people behind the news, that's a good thing. Keep asking questions, keep learning, and keep those critical thinking skills sharp.
And maybe most importantly, keep Sudiksha and her family in your thoughts. This case isn't over yet, and there's still hope that she'll be found safe.
We'll definitely be watching for any updates on this case. And until next time, stay curious, stay informed, and stay safe.